name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I want to share with you my 5 top tips for acrylic painting and then things I wish I knew when I started acrylic painting for the first time. So the first thing you should always do when starting to add acrylic paint to a surface is start with gesso. I have some Liquitex gesso here. I buy it in liter bottles because that's how much I use on my canvas paintings and in my art journals. So for this page, I've already added the gesso to the page. So here's the same watercolor paper. And you can see that when I added just some watercolor paint to it, it is very uneven. The surface isn't going to absorb paint evenly, and because of that, that's going to make it very hard when you're adding your acrylic paint, because if you're adding a stroke, it's not going to go on evenly, it's going to go on patchy. So by adding a layer of gesso or even 2 layers of gesso, so that evens out the surface and allows you to have more success in painting. And if you haven't seen my canvas and art journal prep video, I've included it up in the card above and in the description below. In that video, I go into a lot more detail about canvas and art journal prep. But you always want to start with gesso because it provides tooth for the surface, it allows the paint to stick more evenly, and you're just generally going to get better results. My second tip would be to choose the right brush. When you are doing backgrounds like this, you don't want to be using a tiny brush like this to add your gesso or your paint. You want to be using a brush like this. When you are doing large surfaces, you want a brush that will get the surface covered as quickly as possible. These larger ones I usually use for my canvas projects, but I would say that generally when I'm adding gesso, when I'm adding general color to a background, I usually stick to an inch brush or slightly larger brush than an inch brush. And I generally work with flat brushes. When I started, I always thought that, oh, I need to always use a round brush like this. And what I found is that a round brush is great for tiny little details. A round brush is great for just adding in maybe a little edge part. They're not really great for adding strong strokes of color, so I almost predominantly use a flat brush. It allows you to get really tiny little edges. It also allows you to get a lot more flatter areas as well. The flat brushes is generally what I stick to mostly in my painting. They take a little while to get used to, but I find I like the mark making of them. The other thing is you could use a round brush if you're looking for particular mark making. I actually use these filbert brushes, the ones with the more rounded tips. I use those a lot for birds, for getting the feathers, because you kind of get that nice stroke of a round edge of the feather when you're working on birds. And so generally I would say always go for a brush that is larger than what you think. I find that when I started painting, I was quite timid. So what I would do is I take a little brush like this and add in color and add in things onto my surface. And my teacher's always like, grab a bigger brush. She's like, here, grab your inch brush. Add 3 strokes instead of adding 15 tiny strokes. Because the reason you want a larger brush is it gives you a more even coat of paint on your surface. It depends if you want all these tiny brush marks. You may want that, but generally when you're trying to cover up the surface, you're going to want to use a larger brush. And I'll get into that a little bit more as I demonstrate in this painting. So before I get into our next step, I was thinking I would give you a little bit of why I've started with the image already. If you've seen my video about composition, you will know that I generally use a rule of thirds, and I generally try to add my image to the page before I start painting. And to add the rule of thirds and the image, I use my Neocolor 2 watercolor crayons. And the reason for that, by adding it with watercolor crayon, you don't have to worry about these lines later on. They basically disappear as you paint. By adding a rule of thirds and doing a little bit of planning before, that's generally going to give you a better finished product. And actually for this one, I used my toned sketchbook here and did a value sketch as well. I want to figure out my values and figure out where my lights and darks are even before I start adding paint to my canvas. So a little bit of preparation will go a long way. The biggest thing to think about is when you're trying to paint, you want to make sure that you thin your paint. So I'm dipping into my water here. And what I'm doing is I'm running my paintbrush along the edge and then I'm pulling it into my paint. And you can see I almost have too much water on my brush. So what I often do is I'll take that other side and I will just use a shop towel to pull a little bit of that water off the brush. So now you're seeing that the paint is moving a little bit. This is the kind of consistency that you want. You want to be painting in thin layers. You don't want to be painting in huge thick layers on your surface. And because I'm just doing a little bit of my first layer on this, I'm just going to just add it very quickly onto the surface. And one inch brush is almost a little bit too big for some of these details. But you can see that it's a very easy way to get a really thin, fine layer of paint onto your surface. And you can see that as I'm adding it to that watercolor, it's pretty much covering up any of the watercolor on the paper. And then if you need a little bit more water, again, pull it along the side, press into the towel so you don't have too much on the surface. And then you can just add some more. And the reason you want to thin your paint is I always paint in layers. And when you paint in layers, you start getting some really fun final results from your painting. Because this is what I found is when I started, I used to just chunk the paint on like that. And what you notice is that if you have areas where you're just trying to do it as one solid coat, it's really hard for me to do now because I'm not used to doing it. It doesn't really give a good final result. And what you run into is that it looks really thick, it looks really heavy, and it doesn't really look very nuanced. And the whole point with painting is you work in layers, you work in shades. And especially with acrylic paint, working in shades is definitely the way to go. And because this paintbrush is actually a little bit too big, I am moving to a smaller guy. And this will make it a little bit easier just to get those colors in. And that's more of a highlight there, so I am just leaving that kind of as it is. I usually try to start with my midtones. It's a really good way of just adding in color to your surface. It's really important to thin your paint just because you do get a much better final product from your painting. But you can see in some areas that the paint is so thin that it's almost transparent, and that's okay for washes, but sometimes it's a little bit thinner than you really want to put it on. And it takes a little bit of practice to figure out how much water to paint ratio you want to use. So if you struggle with that, try using a satin glazing liquid. What this is it's meant for glazing, but what it will do is it will thin your paint beautifully. The first year or so that I was painting, this is something that I used. So instead, I would go in with a fairly dry brush. I would grab a little bit of paint, and this paint's a little bit old. It's getting a little crunchy. And then I would just basically add in a little bit of the glazing liquid, and then I would add in a little bit more of the glazing liquid. And between a little bit of the water that's on your brush and the glazing liquid, now you have a thinner paint. And then I could go in and add it onto my surface, and I would have something that would help me kind of get that feeling of learning to paint with thinner paint. But because I was struggling with making sure I had the right amount of paint on my paintbrush, it really helped me to get there and get the result that I was looking for. I don't use it very much anymore just because I have become a lot more practiced and I've done a lot more paintings, and so I don't really need it as that help. But if you are in a place where you're finding painting is really frustrating, try using it. It'll go a long way in helping you figure out how to thin your paint and be able to add those beautiful layers to your surface. Also, when you are choosing paint, I would suggest not sticking with craft paint. I would suggest getting a better quality paint. You can get everything from the Pabio student grade paint, which is a beautiful paint because it really works quite well. But what's nice about it is it's not too expensive. So you'll notice with all these paints that I'm using, they're what are called heavy body paints. So they're quite thick. The intent is that you will thin them a little bit. The intent is that you may add water or glazes or mediums or other things. So it usually starts fairly thick and you will thin it out a little bit as you go. It's a really great way of just thinning things so that you get that result that you're looking for. But when you're using craft paint, the craft paint's so thin, you're not going to be able to get a lot of this beautiful color and the results that you're looking for. And so for this one, I wanted to go quite a bit darker. So what I've done is I have mixed this with some Payne's Gray. And I'm going to add this right here in my painting. And you'll notice that so it still has a beautiful purple color, but it's definitely a lot darker. You can see some of the layers below through it. And that's the point. This allows you to add color gradually and be able to just add beautiful color as you want to instead of just blobbing things on. This gives you the opportunity to really work on adding beautiful layers and seeing kind of what you end up getting as you go. And the veins of this pasque flower are actually quite a bit darker. I'm just adding those layers in now so that I don't forget to add them. And that's really my fourth idea, was that you really want to add small layers. You don't want to try to add everything in one layer. A perfect example of this is, let's say I wanted just to add a dark color to the background. If I went like that, that's not very interesting. If I added a thinner layer of cobalt blue, and because I already had some indigo in my brush, it makes it a bit darker. If you add it like so, now that is a lot more interesting background. By adding those layers, and we'll try to get rid of my mark that I've added. Because the paint's still wet, I can still manage that. And this is where you could add a deeper base, but then what you can do is then you can add other colors on top. So it's really important to thin your paint or learn to thin your paint because it goes a long way on having a much more subtle, more beautiful look. And I think as you learn to paint better, you're going to notice that other artists that you follow, other people that you follow, that they do use a lot of layers. It's better to learn it sooner than later for making sure you end up with the result that you really want in your painting. And the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is color mixing. So you might have noticed I've been color mixing as I've been going. I've been adding my Prism Violet to a little bit of magenta. And that just gives me a slightly different tone, a slightly warmer tone. And then if I wanted to add a little bit of Payne's Gray, that deepens that up. If I did the same thing again and added a little bit of the violet with the magenta, and that one I went too far with the magenta. So you have to be aware of the ratios that you're using just to try to get the right color. And so in this case, because I mixed too much of it, what I will probably do is just take it a little bit of it into this pile because this one already had a little bit of the Prism Violet. There you go. And now if I wanted to lighten this to get a little bit of a lighter hue, I take in a little bit of white. And now I have a nice lighter hue that can kind of go with my painting. When you're painting, I think the key is start working on color mixing, but start with white and black or white and Payne's Gray. I particularly like Payne's Gray because it's a little bit more subtle. It's not going to make your colors too dark too quickly. But if you only have white and black, start with white and black and you'll be able to play around and see what kind of colors that you end up getting. And so with this one, I'm going to add quite a bit more white. And you don't have to do the entire area. You can do a very small area and just start adding in white in places. And this is the beautiful thing about the square brush is I'm able to add in little details in areas that are not really meant for those little details. But you can see that even by adding the white on like I have, or the paler colors, now I could, if I've gone too far with this, then you can add some other colors over top. And you can kind of go back and forth until you kind of get the colors that you're looking for. But you can see that by just adding it in layers, this has also become a lot more painterly instead of just having one really bold color and calling it done. By adding all these little layers, it goes a long way in making your painting look very artistic. And if you are interested in a little bit more about color mixing, I did do a watercolor video where I went in a little bit more into color mixing and how to not make mud and other things. And that one might be very useful for you if you're learning to mix, whether or not you're using watercolor or acrylics. It's a really fun video for just learning how to mix. I actually learned a lot of my mixing through watercolor because I'm using the same colors of it as I am of my regular paints. And it was a really great way of just understanding how the colors mix together without going through a ton of paint. You can see that as I've been painting, I've been doing a lot of layers and going back over and adding more. And some of this is I'm still learning to paint. I've definitely not mastered the art of acrylic paint, but I'm definitely working towards learning to add more layers, adding more highlights, and so sometimes that means going back and forth a little bit. I hope that these tips on how to use acrylic paint in your projects has been helpful. I know acrylic painting at the beginning can seem very complex and a little bit intimidating, and so that's why I wanted to share this video today, because I thought maybe some of my learnings would be helpful for you. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss on any future videos. I also have my full supply list below. Those do include affiliate links, and what that means is that anytime you purchase from one of those links, I do get a small commission at no additional cost to you. So if you're interested in seeing another painting video, click here. This is another one of my art journaling videos where I include painting in the process. And I hope that this will be another way for you to be able to start working on your acrylic painting, and that will get you started. I hope that you have a really great week, that you take time for some personal self-care, and I will see you next time.